As you can see, I have been the victim of some unfortunate circumstances. After the execution of the king and the assassination of Marat, the law of suspects was passed. This allowed for the execution of suspected enemies of the revolution. The enforcement of the law started out targeting people who were outwardly working against the revolution, but quickly evolved as an excuse to arrest and execute anyone suspected of not being in favor of the revolution. Friends of the royal family and nobles were first on the list. Then the guillotine needed more victims. So anyone who ever spoke out against the revolution or the violence that ensued was targeted. Eventually, just using the term mademoiselle or monsieur instead of the accepted citizen would lead to being guillotined. This time period was called the Reign of Terror. Almost 20,000 people were executed during this time period. While it is the most horrifying time of the revolution, it also has resulted in some morbidly fascinating stories. Today on Tales of the Guillotine, we will explore rumors of life after decapitation. We will also take a look at how people face their last moments, including the last words of the victims of the National Razor.
There have been some who have questioned whether the guillotine is truly painless, and if a person dies immediately after the head is severed from the body. There are several stories from the French Revolution that suggest the severed head may live on for a time. The theory is that everything a person needs to think, see, hear, smell, and taste is contained in the head. Would a beheaded person be able to see the crowd when their head is held up? Could they hear the cheers? Some people think so. There are two commonly repeated stories from the French Revolution that suggest that the head may have carried on life for up to 30 seconds after being separated from the body by the guillotine. The first story is from the execution of Antoine Lavoisier. Lavoisier is often referred to as the father of chemistry. He discovered the role that oxygen plays in combustion. He identified and named oxygen and hydrogen, and is partly responsible for the metric system. Well, Lavoisier was an early supporter of the revolution, but later fell out of favor and was accused of abusing his role as a tax collector. He acted as a lawyer for himself and 27 co-defendants, but he was obviously a better scientist than a lawyer because they were all sentenced to the guillotine. Legend has it that Lavoisier used his execution as one last experiment. He supposedly told his assistant to watch his eyes after his head was severed. Lavoisier was going to try and blink as many times as he could until he lost consciousness. It is reported that Lavoisier's eyes blinked 12 or 13 times after his head fell into the basket. Another often reported story of life after the blade comes from the execution of Charlotte Corday. She was sentenced to die after killing Jean-Paul Marat with a knife while he was in his bath. Corday was reportedly very beautiful. So much so that one man wrote a poem about her beauty as she was on her way to the Place de Revolution to face the guillotine. Legend has it that another man was so enchanted by her that he followed her right up the steps of the scaffold. He then stated there should be a statue dedicated to her. For this, he was the next one executed. The real drama, however, started after the blade fell. The young assistant to the executioner held up Charlotte's head for the crowd, and then slapped her face. Many people in the crowd said that her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and her eyes looked towards her tormentor, and Corday's facial expression changed to show an expression of indignation at being slapped. Next, a story about the woman whose execution was the beginning of the end for the Reign of Terror. Most of the condemned stoically marched up the scaffold where the guillotine was located and calmly faced their death. There was little resistance, as one after another, they were dispatched by the National Razor. They were mostly upper class, and weren't going to let the cheering commoners see their fear. Madame du Barry definitely did not take the stoic route. In the cart on the way to the Place de Revolution, she screamed and cried out for the people to help her. She then refused to get out of the cart as it arrived at the execution site. She had to be carried up the stairs of the platform, and she screamed and begged and cried the whole way. The executioners had to physically put her on the guillotine and hold her down as she screamed. This time, after the blade fell, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't react at all. Many fled the Place de Revolution in shame and horror about what they had just witnessed. It wasn't long after this that Robespierre was overthrown and the Reign of Terror was ended. One has to wonder, if there had been more people who reacted like Madame du Barry, instead of feigning bravery to the end, would the terror have stopped sooner? And finally, some last words from the guillotine platform. The last words of the victims of the guillotine were similar to the soon-to-be beheaded's behavior. They were often stoic, such as the last words of the man who led the tennis court oath, Jean-Sylvain Bailly. In a perfect example of how the revolution turned on its own, this original leader of the revolution was eventually considered an enemy of the cause by the Robespierre and the Jacobins, and sentenced to die. When asked why he was trembling as he was about to be executed, Bailey replied, "Because I'm cold." Their words were rarely defiant, except in the case of Danton, who called Robespierre a rat, and were often accepting of their fate, unlike Madame du Barry. The king and queen went rather quietly. The king proclaimed his innocence, but also forgave his accusers. The queen, Marie Antoinette's last words were an apology to the executioner. She accidentally stepped on his foot and said, "I am sorry, sir. I did not do that on purpose." Robespierre's last words were a mumbled, "Merci, monsieur," which means "thank you, sir," to a man who handed him a handkerchief for his bleeding face after the executioner ripped off a bandage that was covering a gunshot wound, which was probably self-inflicted, that Robespierre suffered during his arrest. Legend has it that 11 French nuns were guillotined for counter-revolutionary activity, and that they sang church hymns on their way to the scaffold. These are the stories of just a few of the almost 20,000 people who were executed during the French Revolution. While their stories are fascinating, it is important to remember that they were real people, and almost all were executed without a fair trial. Hopefully the world has learned from the way the French Revolution devolved from a quest for freedom and equality into chaos and mass murder.